Hashtag a threat was sent to Earth, humans treated it like a gift and answered in kind. Hashtag Part 1. The signal came at 3:14 in the morning, Luna time. Leon Hartley was the only one awake in the Signal Corps station when it arrived. He was on his third cup of coffee, half reading a paper on deep-range acoustic patterns, when every monitor in the room lit up at once. He set his cup down slowly. In 11 years of working at the station, he had never seen all the monitors light up at the same time. He rolled his chair to the main console and pulled up the source. The signal was coming from somewhere beyond the orbit of Neptune. It was strong, clean, and deliberate, not the scattered noise of natural space events, but something shaped. Something built. He ran the decryption filters out of habit, even though the signal was not encrypted. It did not need to be. It was already in English. Leon read it once. Then he read it again. Then he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. The message was from something called the Vreth Dominion. Leon had heard the name. Most people who worked in xenolinguistics had. The Vreth were old, not the oldest civilization in the galactic community, but old enough that they had stopped feeling the need to be polite. They had 19 star systems under their control. They had ended 4 civilizations in the last 2 centuries, not by destroying them outright, but by squeezing them until they stopped being civilizations at all. The message was short. It said that Earth had 12 months to dismantle its military forces, give up its colony worlds, and agree to a program that would reduce the human population to a number the Vreth found manageable. It said this was not a request. It said this was not something that could be debated. It said that if Earth did not comply, the Vreth would sterilize the solar system, every planet, every moon, every station. It ended by saying that this message was a courtesy. The Vreth were being kind by giving humanity warning at all. Leon read it a third time. Then he did something that would later be talked about in Signal Corps briefings for years. He did not call the emergency line. He did not page his supervisor. He opened a standard internal message, addressed it to the Department of Strategic Sciences, and wrote 6 words. Have you seen this? Read carefully. He attached the full transmission and sent it. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, quietly, to no one in particular, they told us exactly what they are afraid of. By sunrise, every government on Earth had a copy of the transmission. The Vreth had sent it to all of them simultaneously, which was itself a message. They were not negotiating with one nation, they were addressing the species. The alien embassies in Geneva, staffed by representatives of a dozen other civilizations, had also received it. Most of those representatives gathered in small groups and spoke in low voices. They had seen this before. They knew how it ended. They watched the human news networks carefully, waiting for the panic to begin. It did not begin. There were people who were frightened, of course. There were people in the streets of every major city who held signs and shouted and wept. That was real and it was honest. But the networks, after the first few hours of shock, shifted to something else. Scientists were being interviewed. Military historians were being asked questions. Retired diplomats were talking in calm, careful sentences about what the message actually said and what it implied. A professor of alien political theory, a small woman named Carol Webb from the University of Chicago, sat in front of a camera and said, with complete composure, the interesting thing is what they didn't say. They didn't say they were coming immediately. They gave us a year. That tells you something about them. The alien observers in Geneva noted this. They sent reports home. The reports said, essentially, that the humans were not behaving as expected. Colonel Dana Pruitt arrived at the Joint Stellar Command building in Colorado at 6 a.m. She had not slept. She had read the transmission 4 times on the flight over and had filled 2 pages of a small notebook with observations. She was not the highest-ranking officer in the building that morning, but she was the one who called the session to order, because she was the one who had already figured out what she wanted to say. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the generals and admirals sitting around the long table. Some of them looked tired. Some of them looked angry. A few of them looked the way people look when they are trying very hard not to show that they are afraid. Dana put her notebook on the table. They told us, she said, exactly what they want us to give up. Our military structure, our colonies, and our numbers. Which means those 3 things are exactly what they do not want us to have. So before we do anything else, I want to talk about that. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the admirals, an older man named Frank Cole, leaned forward and said, "Go ahead." She talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, the room was no longer quiet. People were leaning in, asking questions, pulling up data on their tablets. It was not the meeting Dana had expected to be running when she woke up that morning, but it was the right one. Across the city, in a small government office, Leon Hartley's message had been read by a young analyst who had forwarded it up the chain with a note of her own. The note said that the xenolinguist on Luna thought the transmission was not just a threat. It was a document. And documents, her note said, could be studied. Back on Luna, Leon had finally gone to sleep. But before he did, he had printed the transmission and pinned it to the wall above his desk. He had circled 3 phrases in red pen. Next to one of them, he had written a single question mark. Next to another, he had written 2 words, "They're scared." Next to the third phrase, he had written nothing at all. He just stared at it for a while, then turned off the light. Outside the windows of every station, every city, every colony on Mars and Titan, the sky looked the same as it always had. But something had changed. It was not easy to name, but people felt it. The human species had been given 12 months and a list of demands, and instead of falling apart, it had started moving. Quietly. Quickly. The way it always moved when someone gave it a problem it could not ignore. The Vreth surveillance drones, parked cold and dark at the edge of the solar system, watched and recorded everything they could. They sent their data back to Vreth High Command. The analysts who received it read through the reports and then sent back a single question. Why are they not afraid? No one had a good answer. Not yet. But somewhere in a signal corps station on the moon, a man who had been awake for 22 hours was sleeping with a printed transmission pinned to his wall, and 3 circled phrases that were about to change everything. Hashtag a threat was sent to Earth, humans treated it like a gift and answered in kind. Hashtag Part 2. The first month passed the way the first month of any enormous project passes, loud, messy, and full of people arguing about what to do first. There were political fights. There were long sessions in the United Earth Assembly where representatives from different nations pushed different ideas and accused each other of not taking things seriously, or of taking them too seriously, or of taking the wrong things seriously. There were protests outside the assembly building every day. There were counter-protests. There were opinion pieces written by thousands of people who all believed they understood the situation better than everyone else. But underneath all of that noise, something else was happening. It was quieter. It moved faster. And it did not wait for the arguments to end. Cal Brennan did not know about most of the arguments. He was 26 years old, he worked in a propulsion research station in the desert outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he was currently spending 16 hours a day staring at a set of equations that had been sitting at the edge of human understanding for a decade. The equations described something called fold space compression, a method of bending the distance between 2 points in space so a ship could cross it faster than light would on its own. Human ships could already do a version of this. The problem was the upper limit. There was a wall in the math that no one could get past, and every physicist who had tried to get past it had eventually given up and written a paper explaining why the wall was probably permanent. Cal did not believe the wall was permanent. He had not believed it for 3 years. He had a different way of looking at the problem, and on the 41st day after the Vreth transmission arrived, at 2 in the morning, sitting in his small office with an empty coffee mug and a floor covered in printed diagrams, he found the crack. It was not a big crack. It was a tiny, quiet little gap in the logic that everyone else had been stepping over for years without noticing. But when Cal saw it, he felt it the way people feel when something they have been almost seeing finally comes into focus. He sat very still for a long time. Then he started writing. He submitted his paper at 2:47 in the morning. He attached a note that said it probably needed review before anyone got excited. Then he went to sleep on the couch in his office, because it was too far to walk home. He woke up 6 hours later to 17 messages and a call request from the Joint Stellar Command. He stared at his phone for a moment. Then he called back. While Cal was sleeping on his office couch, a woman named Nora Ellison was finishing a 12-hour shift in a materials lab in Pittsburgh. Nora worked for a construction research company. Her job was to find better ways to build things, stronger walls, lighter frames, surfaces that could handle pressure and stress without cracking. For the past 2 years she had been working on a particular kind of composite hull material, originally designed for high-rise buildings in cities that got a lot of noise and heat. The material was very good at absorbing energy. It took the force of something hitting it and spread that force out so evenly that almost nothing got through. She had not been thinking about warships when she built it. She had been thinking about apartments near airports. But 3 weeks after the transmission, a man from the military research office had come to her lab, sat down across from her desk, and asked if she had considered what her material would do to a directed energy weapon. A laser, specifically. Or a plasma burst. Nora had considered it, briefly, and said she had not. The man put a set of test parameters on her desk and asked if she would be willing to run some trials. She ran the trials. The results made her sit quietly for a moment. Then she ran them again to make sure she had not made a mistake. She had not made a mistake. The material absorbed directed energy at rates that no known hull composite in any galactic arms catalog could match. The energy did not bounce back. It did not punch through. It simply spread out and disappeared into the structure, like sound absorbed by foam. She called the man from the military research office and told him the results. He did not say much. He just asked how quickly she could scale the fabrication process up. She told him she would need to hire more people. He told her to hire as many as she needed. Out in the asteroid belt, far from the noise of Earth's debates and late-night labs, a network of relay stations was being built in silence. The project had been approved fast, faster than most government projects moved, because the idea behind it was simple and the people running it were practical. The stations were small, cold, and built to show almost no energy signature. They tucked themselves between rocks and in the shadows of large asteroids, and they stayed dark, only waking up to pass a signal along and then going quiet again. The man who had designed most of the relay layout was not a military engineer. He was a retired cargo hauler named Pete Vasquez, 61 years old, from El Paso. He had spent 30 years running supply routes through the belt, and he knew every rock, every shadow, every quiet corner of that region of space better than almost any active officer in the fleet. When the project coordinator had asked him to help plan the network, he had said yes before the coordinator finished the sentence. Pete worked from a terminal in his kitchen most days, drinking bad tea and drawing routes on a digital map. He was very good at hiding things in plain sight. He understood that the belt was not empty space, it was a maze, and if you knew the maze, you could become invisible inside it. The Vreth drones watching from the outer solar system sent back reports at regular intervals. Their analysts looked at the data and saw construction activity, but the readings were strange. Energy signatures did not match known military profiles. Vessel movements looked like standard shipping routes. The new structures were small and scattered and did not look like anything the Vreth had seen a species build before a war. One of the Vreth analysts, a careful thinker named in their language something that translated roughly to "the one who counts wrong numbers," flagged the reports with a note. The note said that the humans were not building what they expected humans to build. They were building something else. He did not know what it was. His supervisor dismissed the note. The humans were clearly disorganized. The construction was probably an emotional response. Species under threat often built things to feel like they were doing something. It meant nothing. The careful analyst filed his note and said nothing more. But he kept watching. At the 6-month mark, the Vreth sent a single scout ship into the outer solar system. It was not there to fight. It was there to remind Earth that the clock was running. A show of size. A gentle pressure. The scout ship crossed the boundary and broadcast its presence on standard military channels. It was large, much larger than any human vessel the Vreth records showed. A human ship met it 20 minutes later. The human ship was 3 times the scout's tonnage. It had been sitting dark and cold in the shadow of a large rock for 8 weeks. No skin had ever picked it up. It broadcast nothing hostile. It simply appeared, held its position, and waited. The scout ship sat there for a long time. Then it turned and left. No shots were fired. No words were exchanged. Back in his kitchen in El Paso, Pete Vasquez got a short message from the project coordinator. It said, "The ship worked. Thank you." Pete drank his bad tea and looked out the window at the sky. Then he went back to his map and started planning the next phase of the network. The deadline was still 6 months away. There was a lot of work left to do. Hashtag a threat was sent to Earth. Humans treated it like a gift and answered in kind. Hashtag Part 3. Grace Alden had been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Concord for 7 years. In that time she had sat through 412 formal sessions, negotiated 11 trade agreements, attended more dinners with alien dignitaries than she could count, and learned to speak 3 non-human languages well enough to argue in them. She was not a loud person. She did not raise her voice. She had a way of sitting very still in a room and listening that made other people feel, sometimes uncomfortably, that she was understanding them better than they were understanding themselves. When the Vreth transmission arrived, Grace was already in the Concord building in orbit above the neutral station at Vela Point. She read the transmission twice, set it aside, and then spent the next 3 days attending events, shaking hands, and saying very little about the message directly. She watched faces. She listened to what people did not say. She was very good at that. On the 4th day, she sent 3 private requests for meetings. Not to any of the large, powerful civilizations in the Concord. To 3 small ones. Species that had, at various points in the last 100 years, received letters not entirely unlike the one Earth had just received. 2 of them had given in. 1 had fought and lost. All 3 of them were still around, technically, but they were smaller than they had been. Quieter. They had learned to stay out of the way. Grace met with them one at a time, in small rooms with no official record keeping. She did not ask them for anything. She asked them questions. She wanted to know what the Vreth had done, step by step. She wanted to know what had worked and what had not worked. She wanted to know what the Vreth were actually afraid of, not what they said, but what they avoided, what made them hesitate, what made their timelines slip. She took extensive notes in a small brown notebook that she carried everywhere. By the time she flew back to Earth at the 8-month mark, she had 3 notebooks full of information and a clear idea of what she was going to do with it. Leon Hartley had been recalled from Luna. He was now working in a converted conference room in a government building in Washington, surrounded by 3 other xenolinguists and a wall covered in printed pages. The task he had been given was unusual. He was not being asked to translate a document. He was being asked to help write one, in Vreth. Not just grammatically correct Vreth. Culturally precise Vreth. The kind of Vreth that a Vreth military officer would read and understand not as the words of a desperate species begging for mercy, but as the words of something that did not feel desperate at all. That distinction mattered enormously. Leon knew it. The others in the room knew it. A document that sounded afraid, even slightly, would be read as weakness. A document that sounded arrogant would be dismissed. The tone had to be something very specific, calm, precise, and completely unbothered. The tone of something that had already done the math and was sharing the results as a professional courtesy. Leon spent 6 weeks working on the opening paragraph alone. The document itself was 74 pages long. The first section was a detailed analysis of how the Vreth Dominion fought wars. It covered their military doctrine, their supply chain structure, their preferred engagement ranges, their historical timelines for campaigns, and the specific conditions under which their past victories had been achieved. Every single piece of information in it came from public records, things the Vreth had published themselves, history recorded by the Galactic Concord, accounts from the civilizations they had absorbed. Nothing in it was secret. That was the point. The Vreth would read it and know immediately that humans had not broken into any classified system. They had simply read everything that was available and understood it better than the Vreth expected them to. The second section was the one that took the longest to write. It described, in plain and careful language, what a prolonged conflict with Earth would actually cost the Vreth Dominion. Not in terms of ships and weapons, though those numbers were there too, but in terms of time, logistics, and the specific difficulties of fighting a species that had spent most of its history fighting itself. Humans had been at war with each other, in one form or another, for nearly all of their recorded existence. That was not something most alien civilizations understood the full implications of. It meant that humans had been building, testing, and refining ways to resist occupation and sustain conflict for thousands of years. The knowledge was in their institutions, their history, their habits of mind. An occupying force would not be fighting a military. It would be fighting a culture. Leon wrote that section 3 times before he was satisfied with how it read in Vreth. The third section was Grace's. She wrote it herself, in English, and then worked with Leon to put it into Vreth. It was the shortest section of the 3. It was also the most important. It was not a threat. It was an offer. The offer was this: Earth knew that the Vreth Dominion had a problem on their northern frontier. A border dispute with 2 neighboring species that had been draining Vreth military resources for 30 years. The Vreth had been unable to resolve it because neither of the neighboring species trusted Vreth mediation, for obvious reasons. The conflict was not large enough to be decisive, but it was persistent and expensive. Earth was offering to solve it. The 3 civilizations Grace had been meeting with in quiet rooms, the ones the Vreth had previously pressured, had agreed, after many careful conversations, to join a joint guarantee of Vreth border security on that frontier. Earth would mediate the underlying dispute. Earth would back the arrangement diplomatically and, if necessary, in other ways. The northern frontier problem would be over. In exchange, the Vreth Dominion would formally withdraw its ultimatum and open trade negotiations with Earth on standard Concord terms. The offer was written in language that gave the Vreth room to say yes without feeling like they had lost. Grace understood that pride was not just a feeling, it was a political tool, and powerful entities needed a way to change direction that did not look like retreat. She had built that into every sentence. The document was signed by 46 people. Dana Pruitt signed it. Cal Brennan signed it. Nora Ellison signed it. Leon Hartley signed it. Grace Alden signed it last. Pete Vasquez had called and asked if he could sign it too, and Grace had said yes, because she thought that was right. The document was transmitted to the Vreth Dominion with 9 weeks left on the countdown. There was no dramatic moment when it was sent. Leon hit the transmission button in the converted conference room at 4:22 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Someone had brought sandwiches. People ate their sandwiches and waited. The Vreth did not respond immediately. A day passed. Then 2. Then a week. The Vreth surveillance drones held their positions at the edge of the solar system and transmitted data home at regular intervals, but no reply came back the other direction. Inside the Vreth High Command, the document was being passed from desk to desk. Some of the senior officers read it once and set it aside and said it was a stalling tactic. Others read it more carefully and said nothing for a while. The small faction, the one that had been worried since the scout ship encounter, read it very carefully indeed. The careful analyst who had been flagging unusual reports for months read the 3rd section 4 times. Then he wrote a note to his superior that said, simply, "They know about the northern frontier." His superior read the note. For once, he did not dismiss it. On Earth, the countdown clock was still running. 6 weeks. 5. 4. Leon had gone back to reading signal data in the evenings, because he could not sit still and waiting was the hardest part. Dana Pruitt was running readiness drills, because whatever happened, she believed in being ready. Pete Vasquez was working on a secondary relay layer in the asteroid belt, because he had never been able to stop working once he started. And Grace Alden was already thinking about what she would say when the Vreth finally called. She was fairly sure they would call. She had been right about these things before. #A threat was sent to Earth, humans treated it like a gift and answered in kind. ## Part 4. The Vreth were silent for 11 days. 11 days of nothing. No response, no counter-transmission, no movement from the drones at the edge of the solar system. The countdown clock kept running. The news networks filled the silence with experts, with analysis, with speculation. Most people tried to keep living normally, because there was nothing else to do. Some people managed it. Some did not. Dana Pruitt spent those 11 days running drills and sleeping 4 hours a night. Not because she believed the document had failed, she had read it carefully and she believed in it, but because she was the kind of person who did not know how to stop preparing for the worst case just because the best case was also possible. On the 12th day, a ship appeared on the outer sensor net. It was not a warship. It was smaller than the scout that had turned back 6 months earlier, and it was broadcasting on the standard Concord diplomatic frequency, open, loud, visible to every scan in the solar system. The signal it carried was a formal request for parley under Concord Protocol 7, which was the protocol used between civilizations that were not currently in active conflict but might become so. It was, technically, a civilized signal. The Vreth were doing it correctly. Leon was the one who decoded the formal request, because he was always the one who decoded things. He sent a short message to Grace that said, "They called." Grace sent back a message that said, "I know. Pack a bag." They met at the transit hub on Earth and took the same shuttle up to the neutral station above Callisto. The station was not impressive, a functional place, maintained by the Concord for exactly this kind of meeting, with plain walls and rooms that smelled faintly of recycled air. Grace had been there 3 times before. She liked it. There was no theater to it. It was just a room where people talked. Dana came with them as security lead. She wore her uniform but left the rank insignia less prominent than usual. She did not explain why and no one asked. Pete Vasquez had called Grace the day before and asked if he could come. Grace had considered it for about 3 seconds and then said yes. He was one of the 46 signatories. He had earned the right to be in the room. Pete showed up at the transit hub with a small bag and a thermos of coffee. He did not say much on the shuttle. He looked out the window at the dark and the stars and seemed quietly satisfied with everything. The Vreth delegation arrived 6 hours after Earth's team. They came through the docking bay in a group of 9, led by a tall figure in formal Vreth diplomatic robes. This was the second voice of the Dominion, the title translated roughly to Deputy Foreign Minister in human political terms. He was old. His movements were deliberate and careful, the way the movements of old powerful beings tend to be. He had conducted the surrender negotiations of 4 civilizations. He had never been on the other side of the table. Leon noticed that immediately. He noticed it in the way the second voice held himself when he entered the room, not arrogant, exactly, but adjusted. Like someone who had walked through a familiar door and found the furniture rearranged. Grace greeted the delegation in standard Concord form, the correct gestures, the correct phrasing, in Vreth. The second voice responded correctly. The formalities were brief and professional. Then everyone sat down. The talks lasted 6 days. They were not easy. Nothing about it was easy. The Vreth were proud in a way that ran very deep, not the pride of people who thought well of themselves, but the pride of people who had built an identity entirely around never having to back down. That kind of pride does not bend. It has to be worked around, given space, shown a door that looks different from the one it came in through. Grace was very good at finding doors. On the second day, the talks nearly ended. The second voice made a statement that was technically within the bounds of the agreement framework but was clearly designed to test how much pressure Grace would absorb before she pushed back. She did not push back. She acknowledged the statement, noted its implications, and redirected the conversation to the Northern Frontier question in a way that made the Vreth delegation look at each other briefly before refocusing. Leon, sitting to Grace's left, caught the look. He made a small note. On the 4th day, there was a real breakdown. One of the junior Vreth delegates said something that translated, in the very precise Vreth that Leon had been working in for months, to a suggestion that the whole document was a fabrication, that Earth did not actually have the support of the 3 civilizations it claimed. That the coalition was invented. The room went quiet. Dana, sitting along the wall, did not move, but Leon knew she was paying very close attention. Grace let the silence sit for a moment. Then she asked Leon to please pull up the 3 recorded statements of support from the coalition civilizations, time-stamped and Concord certified, which had been attached as appendices to the original document. Leon pulled them up and put them on the room display without saying anything. The junior delegate looked at them. Said nothing. Looked away. The second voice spoke quietly to the junior delegate in a dialect Leon did not fully catch. Whatever he said, the junior delegate did not raise that point again. On the 6th day, the second voice signed the preliminary framework agreement. It was a careful document, shorter than the 74-page original, because framework agreements were meant to establish direction, not detail. The detail would come later, in further negotiations that would probably take years. But the framework said the important things. The Vreth Dominion formally withdrew its ultimatum. It opened trade negotiations with Earth on standard Concord terms. It acknowledged the border security arrangement on the northern frontier and accepted Earth's offered mediation of the underlying dispute. It said all of this in precise Vreth legal language that Leon had helped draft the night before, sitting in a small room in the station with a cup of cold tea and a translation guide. When the second voice put down the signing instrument, he looked at Grace for a moment. He said something. Leon translated it quietly for the others. "You are a young species." It was not said with contempt. It was said the way someone says something when they're trying to understand it. Grace smiled and said, in Vreth, "Yes. We have a lot to learn." The second voice looked at her for another moment. Then he stood and led his delegation out. When the Vreth delegation's ship undocked and moved away from the station, Grace sat in the meeting room for a little while with Leon and Pete and Dana. No one said very much. Pete had his thermos out and poured everyone a small amount of coffee. It was cold and not very good. They drank it anyway. The news of the Callisto Accords went out across the galactic community over the next several hours. The reaction was wide and varied and, in many corners of the Concord, very loud. The loudest reactions came from civilizations that had a long history with the Vreth, who understood what it meant that the Dominion had withdrawn an ultimatum, formally and on record. It had not happened in 300 years. The last time it had happened, it was because the civilization being threatened had built something genuinely terrifying in the space of a very short time. Earth had built something too. It just looked different from what anyone expected. Dana flew home and wrote her 4-line memo and filed it and went to sleep for 11 hours. It was the most sleep she had gotten in months. Cal Brennan ordered a large pizza for his team in Albuquerque and sat on the floor of the lab eating it, because all the chairs were covered in equipment. Nora Ellison called her mother in Pittsburgh and talked for an hour about nothing in particular, which was the best kind of conversation. Leon flew back to Luna. He had new signal data waiting for him. There was always new signal data. And Pete Vasquez drove home to El Paso and sat on his porch in the evening and looked at the sky for a long time. The stars looked the same as they always had. Quiet and very far away and full of things that were still being figured out. He finished his tea and went inside. There was still a second relay layer to plan. # a threat was sent to Earth. Humans treated it like a gift and answered in kind. ## Part 5. 6 months after the Callisto Accords were signed, the Galactic Concord held a formal session that was, officially, about trade route restructuring in the Outer Arm. It was not really about that. Everyone in the building knew it was not really about that. It was about Earth. Grace Alden sat in the human delegation seats and listened to 2 hours of procedural business before the session moved to the part that mattered. One by one, representatives from several civilizations made statements. The statements were formal and careful. The Concord ran on formal, careful language, but the meaning inside them was plain enough. The Vreth Dominion had backed down. The Callisto Accords were on record. And the galactic community was trying to figure out what, exactly, that meant about Earth. Grace listened to all of it. She did not say much when it was her turn. She thanked the Concord for recognizing the Accords, noted that the Northern Frontier mediation was proceeding on schedule, and sat back down. She had learned, over 7 years, that the most powerful thing she could do in a room full of people trying to understand her was to give them less than they expected. It worked every time. On the flight back to Earth, she read through 3 messages that had arrived while she was in session. Each one was from a different small civilization. Each one was asking, in carefully worded diplomatic language, essentially the same question: does Earth take cases? The first was from a species called the Avendi, a quiet and long-lived people who had been steadily losing territory to a regional power for 40 years through a process of incremental legal pressure, not war, exactly, but something that functioned like war in slow motion. The second was from a group called the Teresi, who had a straightforward military problem and not enough ships to solve it alone. The third was from a civilization that had no commonly used name in Concord records yet. They were new enough that most of the older species were still deciding whether they were worth noting. Grace read all 3 messages twice. Then she opened a new document and started writing. She did not call it the Answer Bureau at first. That name came from Pete Vasquez later, in a conversation that was not meant to be official. But when the name landed, it stuck, because it was accurate. That was what the office did. It answered. Leon joined first, because Grace asked him and he said yes before she finished the question. He had been back on Luna for 6 months, running signal data and occasionally being consulted on VREF linguistic matters by the team handling the frontier mediation. He was good at that work and he liked it, but when Grace called and said she was building something new, he felt something shift in him that he recognized as purpose. He packed up his office on Luna into 4 boxes and moved to a building in Washington that smelled like old carpet and good coffee. The office was too small and the chairs were bad. He did not mind. Grace brought in Owen Clark next. Owen was 29, from Baltimore, and had been working as a junior diplomat in the Concord liaison office for 3 years. He had a quality that Grace had noticed early on: he could sit in a room with people who were in conflict and find, very quickly, what each side actually wanted beneath what they were saying they wanted. Those two things were almost never the same, and the gap between them was usually where every problem lived. Owen could see the gap. He was surprised to be asked. He said yes immediately. The last person Grace recruited was a woman named Marie Sutton. Marie was a conflict historian at a university in Boston. She had spent 20 years studying how civilizations collapsed, not from outside attack, but from within, from the slow failure of the things that held them together. She knew the patterns. She knew what worked and what did not work and why. Grace wanted someone in the room who understood failure as well as she understood success. Marie said she would need to finish teaching her current semester first. Grace said that was fine. The answer bureau handled the Avendi situation first, because it was the most urgent. The legal pressure being used against them was slow, but it was accelerating, and if it went another 5 years without being addressed, the Avendi would lose a key colony system and probably not recover from it. Owen worked the case for 3 months, reading every document, sitting in every session, building a picture of what the other side actually wanted. What they actually wanted turned out to be reliable access to a specific trade corridor that the Avendi system sat beside. The Avendi had not understood that was the issue. The other side had not said it directly. Owen found it in the gap. Leon drafted the framework document. Grace negotiated the final terms. The Avendi kept their colony. The Teresi problem took longer and was more complicated and involved 2 sessions that nearly fell apart and one night where Owen and Leon argued for 4 hours about the right approach before settling on something that neither of them had suggested at the start. The final agreement was not perfect. It was good enough, which was sometimes better. The young unnamed civilization, the one with no common name in the Concord yet, had received something very much like the transmission Earth had received from the VREF. They had broadcast it widely because they did not know what else to do. They were afraid, and afraid in the very specific way of a species that has just understood, for the first time, how large the universe is and how small they are in it. Leon was the one who intercepted their broadcast. He was running his standard signal monitoring on a late evening in the Washington office, half thinking about something else, when it came in. He decoded it slowly and carefully, because the language structure was unlike anything he had seen before, and getting it wrong mattered. When he had it, he read it twice. Then he sat back and looked at the window for a long moment. Outside, it was dark and the city lights were on, and somewhere above all of it, very far away, a young species was broadcasting its fear into space and hoping someone was listening. Leon opened a new document. He thought for a moment. He thought about the morning he had read the VREF transmission for the first time, alone in the Luna station at 3 a.m., and had felt something click into place. He thought about the 3 phrases he had circled in red pen and the question mark he had written next to one of them. He thought about Grace and Dana and Pete and Cal and Nora and Owen and Marie and the 46 signatures on a 74-page document that had changed something. He started typing. He knew what to say. He had done this before, in a way. The specifics were different species, different threat, different language, but the shape of it was the same. There was a problem. The problem had a structure. The structure could be understood. And things that could be understood could be answered. He worked for 2 hours before calling Grace. When she picked up, he did not say hello. He just said, "We have a new case." Grace was quiet for a moment. He heard her pick up something, a pen, probably. She was always picking up a pen. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Outside the window, the city hummed with its usual noise, traffic and voices and the low steady sound of a lot of people living their lives. The stars were not visible through the light, but they were there. They were always there. And out among them, a young species that had never met humanity was waiting to find out if anyone had heard them. Someone had. Leon kept typing, and Grace kept listening, and the answer bureau was already at work. That was the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy kept learning, one way or another, in one situation or another, they did not stop. Not when things were hard. Not when the problem was too big. Not when the odds were not in their favor. They found the shape of the problem, and then they built something that fit it, and they signed their names to it, and they sent it. Every single time.